Hi there, welcome back to Looking Outside. Today on the pod, we're going to explore the intersection of creativity, advertising, culture strategy, all the areas that marketers love and breathe, and arguably the areas, when done well, propel a good brand to a great brand. This conversation has been a long time coming, and I'm so excited to be joined for this chat by someone that I truly admire so much, and if I do say so myself, is a leading voice in this topic. Juan Isaza, welcome to the show, Juan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having
Yeah,
me.
finally, we made it happen. I'm so excited.
Yes, 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 yes.
So let's start with a little introduction into who you are.
Well, I'm Juan Isaza. I'm head of strategy in DDB Latina. DDB Latina is the division of DDB Worldwide, the advertising agency that includes the markets of Latin America, the Hispanic market of the US, and Spain. So that's basically what I do from a working perspective. Well, I'm now leading the strategy in 14, which is one of the agencies of DDB based in Barcelona. And I lead the brand strategy for Seat and Cupra, the two brands from Volkswagen Group. Um, and from a personal perspective, I was born in Colombia. I have lived in many countries. I'm kind of a nomad now, based in Dallas, but traveling every month to Barcelona. I lived previously in Miami, and before that in Mexico City. Before that in Bogota, in Colombia. Before that in Australia, in Melbourne. So yeah, like kind of a mix of many places and experiences. I love traveling, and I love discovering like different cultures and having different perspectives of the world, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for coming to us live from Barcelona for this recording. Amazing. I'm going to be in Barcelona. We were just talking about this in a couple of weeks. I'm going to get all the tips of basically where to eat. It's all about the food for me when I'm traveling. I don't know about you.
Oh,
Are you
absolutely.
more of like a museum visitor, or history, or food?
I'm super nerdy, super nerd in terms of tourism. I love museums, libraries, bookstores. But I also enjoy local food. That's very important for me. I'm always, when traveling, the most important thing is that I feel like I'm connecting with a culture. So
Mm.
all that implies, from culture, art, music, everything from the local culture. I'm not a travel. I never travel to a beach or to no. I prefer to travel to a city to walk
Mhm.
the streets and use public transportation and all that. I enjoy that a lot.
Yeah, definitely. And also I can imagine like talking to the locals, like speaking to everyday people, like like maybe not the train driver, but train passengers and people in a cafe, and like really immersing yourself in that culture. That would be really valuable for your job as well, because such a huge part of your role is really understanding different cultures, the nuances within culture, and then trying to find, like the commonalities and the similarities, but also probably the differences between them and what makes them unique so that you can speak to them in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And apart from talking to people, I'm a big observer. Like I love going to a cafe and just observing, or going to a supermarket and see how people, you know, uh, how they buy, what they buy. Like I love that, like that
Mm.
ethnographic kind of exercises.
Yeah, that's awesome. We're going to talk about the fact that you have lived in so many different markets and you do a lot of work representing Latin America. I'm going to come back to that. What I wanted to touch on first, though, which I have to, and I don't know if we've spoken about this, you and I, but let's talk about it now. So you studied at RMIT in Melbourne, which is where I'm from in Australia. So how long were you in Oz, and what did you like about Australia?
Well, I was in Australia for almost 2 years, doing my master's in RMIT, and at the same time, I was working in OMB, that is a media agency in Melbourne. I was working part time, and it was a great experience. I mean, it's a city that I mean, I was part of the reason I was living in Colombia before Australia, and part of the reason why I wanted to move to Australia, as many Colombians that you probably have met so everywhere in the world, we were like living in a very complicated country back in those days. So it was the idea of like finding a city that you could feel safe, and Melbourne is that. It's just like wonderful weather, wonderful people, safe, full of opportunities, and really I really enjoyed the time in I live in Melbourne. It's yeah, it's a wonderful city. I want to come back at some point. I haven't been after I leave,
Oh, you
but I
haven't
want
been
to go
back.
and visit.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to go and visit soon. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And when you were in Australia, did you do like a road trip around Australia at all, or did you stay in Melbourne the whole time?
Yeah, not that much. Well, I went to Sydney uh
Mm.
often. I went to Sydney often. I had friends there, and family, but most of the time I was in Melbourne. I did some
Mm.
trips around Victoria and discovering a little bit of the. I remember Ballarat. Uh,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
like those. Yeah, those little
Mm.
towns, and well, Ballarat is not a little town, but um, yeah, towns and Ballarat. I remember a lot, and I enjoyed a
Yeah.
lot that time in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. I wonder if we like walked past each other one day because I used to spend a lot of time out in Ballarat in the chocolate factory when I was working at Mars. So probably like cross paths at some point throughout my time in Melbourne as well. So I'm curious, Juan, then, because you're quite a leading voice inside of the advertising, strategy, communications, marketing, culture, everything space. We'll get into a little bit of that and your perspective on how that's working in a second. But I wanted to ask, the journey of people from where they started to where they get to is really, really interesting for me because sometimes it's kind of accidental or spontaneous opportunities present themselves. So when you were studying marketing, when you did your master's in marketing, did you have a plan to end up at an advertising agency? Obviously you're doing a lot of strategy, so not just creating ads or comms, but that's a big part of what you do. Was that always something that drew you in that field of marketing as communications, or was it kind of accidental?
It was a mix, but it's funny because I when since I remember, I wanted to be a journalist. That was my
Oh.
dream. When if you ask me when I was 7 years old, I was like, I'm going to be a journalist.
Mm,
And I did journalism in university. It was journalism and communications. It was
mm-hmm.
but I wanted to be a journalist. And when I graduated from undergrad, I started working in a newspaper, and I hate it. Well, I shouldn't say I hate it. I mean, I didn't hate it, but it was not what I was expecting. I mean, the pressure you have, it was a very complicated time in Colombia. So, like a lot of journalists having, like life threats and very complicated things. And I was like, I'm not, I don't want to, this is not what I was expecting. I was more expecting like, discovering the stories, telling stories, like all that. So I went. So I finished my internship in this newspaper, and there was an opportunity in DDB. Actually, I started working in DDB uh, in because of that. So I was like, well, advertising is something that is interesting. I've had studied the subject in university. I like it, and marketing was something interesting to me, something that was appealing. So I started in an advertising agency because of that, and I have to say that I learned a lot from that time in a newspaper. because I learned, you have to be very resourceful. You need to basically, you are in charge of a page or 2 pages per day. So you need to find the content, you need to be interesting, you need to find some stories to tell. So I learned that, and at the end of the day, strategy is a lot about storytelling, and strategy in when you build brands is about finding a good storytelling that connects with people. So in that sense, I think those months working in a newspaper were very interesting and formative time for me.
Yeah. And I like how you can see the thread in that as well. So what you were saying is journalism is about going a little bit deeper and uncovering something, the discovery that you mentioned, and then forming that into a really compelling and sometimes like quite a pithy, like short, sharp, clean story that people can easily understand. And obviously, like there's a wealth of stuff that sits behind it, but you're just presenting kind of like, a smaller snippet of it, which is so much of strategy, right? Because oftentimes when you're presenting a strategy, there's so much work that sits behind that that you don't present because there's no point. People are looking for the so what and the now what and what should I do about this. So I can see the connection there, and I can
Yeah,
imagine that you've applied a lot of those skills into your current role.
yeah. And also that ability to keep people's attention, the attention span is getting shorter and shorter. And when you're writing for a newspaper, you have one page to tell a lot of things, and you have to keep people engaged. And it's like the same thing you have to do with brands. You have to tell stories, and you have to keep people interested in the brand, um,
Mm.
which is quite of a challenge.
Yeah, definitely a challenge right now in the world of short attention spans and very short form content, which I know that you're doing a lot of now with DDB, obviously, but also with the agency that you mentioned that you're also working for out of Barcelona, 14. So I guess over the time that you've been in that field of communications and strategy for branding, what's kind of like a one big shift that you've really noticed that's happening with how brands have to communicate with culture?
Yeah, well, I think the power of emotion. I think we are getting more and more conscious about the importance of emotion. And actually, for me, it's very interesting to see clients, marketing people, people that have a purely marketing background that now talks a lot about emotions, and how are we engaging people, how are we going to 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 generate and to strengthen that connection between brands and consumers, and it's obviously through emotion. So for me, that's something that is now something that I see very positively, because obviously creativity and emotion are very connected. I mean, the way you can generate emotions in marketing is through creativity. So that's something that for me is now is increasingly interesting, and it's a challenge, obviously, because I mean, being creative is 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 challenging, because like you have a good campaign, you have a good idea, and it works for the brand, but next you have to get a better idea, or how to follow up that idea, to make it bigger. So it's always the challenge.
Mm. Yeah, of course. And the piece on emotions is really interesting as well because it kind of touches on two things that you have written about. And I know you mentioned, like journalism and writing for publications, and you write for Forbes. So I'll link that into the comments as well. Some really interesting pieces that you've put out recently. One of them touches on the fact that connected into emotions and really understanding people. You talk about building empathy and really anchoring customer your customer strategy or your communication towards a customer, whether it's innovations or the way that you communicate into empathy. And then also kind of the bit that you touch on, which is so prevalent right now, is the heightened emotions that we're seeing. So the kind of the very sensitive, very sensitive way that brands do have to communicate in a state of the world where emotions are running high, and brands can get caught in the middle of pretty tense political topics, which we're obviously seeing play out quite extensively right now. So, how do you, what kind of advice do you give to brands when they're trying to straddle that line where they're trying to really connect with emotions and understand where people are right now emotionally and build the empathy connection with them, but also being sensitive of like not throwing a brand into the midst of a highly tense social or political situation?
Well, it's that question is very interesting because you know that what we've seen in the last few years is this idea of how brands should like get into causes or speak out on current events and all. And what we see now for the first time is in the last few years is that consumers are apparently less interested on brands like taking a stance, in a political point of view. And I think one of the reasons is because consumers are really tired of this polarization. Like when you see in the news all the time these confrontations and polarization and all, like you don't expect brands to get into that. Like what happened last year with Bud Light. It was for me was like a very significant case because it was like a consumer probably, I mean, there are many reasons and we could discuss that case for hours because it has a lot of perspectives. But for me at some point was a consumer like saying that don't mess my peers with the political situation or with diversity and all that,
Mm-hmm.
which is I mean, at some point it's sad because at the end of the day, it's like what like was trying to, generate more like a connection, diversity, like promoting like diversity. But at some point the consumer is probably tired of that. So no, what I would tell brands or what I usually tell my clients is like first you have to understand really well your audience. You have to have credentials. You cannot from, like out of nowhere like now I'm defending this cause or now I'm like advocating for trans, and you have no credentials, you don't even like have any internal credentials in your company and all. So you have to have credentials, you have to know your audience and how relevant is that because your audience uh, can be interested in diversity, but other like there are other causes that probably are more relevant for them. Um, and do it with like do it with, with a sense of this is what we do, not this is what we think. Like I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if you know what I mean. It's more about
Mm-hmm.
doing things rather than saying things, and consumers are now like very careful on that differentiation. So I think part of the consumer saying I don't want um, or I don't expect brands to speak out on current events doesn't mean I don't want brands to do good things for society. It's just like I want them to do things, not just to say things.
Right. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean because I almost literally had that word for word written down as a question for you is how important is it what a brand thinks or what it's doing versus how it's doing it or actually showing the action in the back end of how it's addressing some of these major issues that it wants to be known for addressing, but where is the starting point? So I think that's a really nice way to articulate it. So I'm not sure
Actually,
if you,
if I
yeah.
if I can add something in on that,
Mm,
like I
mm,
remember clients telling me like, how can we talk about diversity or how can we, like defend a cause or whatever? And I was like, before thinking what cause you want to defend, tell me about your company. And I mean, what's the
mm,
percentage of women in your management? Oh, it's 50%. Well, go and say that. So you
yeah.
already have something to do instead of thinking, what
Mm,
should I, like what space of diversity should I create? Look at you, and if you don't have the diversity right, so fix it first, and then that's your cause. Your best cause is something that is a real thing that you're living inside your company, because that's something that we're seeing increasingly important for consumers, like what's happening inside the company, what's the
Mm.
reality of the employees of the company.
Mm. And equally something that you've already achieved, like the success metric that you've already met, and then you can talk about it versus just talking about your ambitions and your targets,
That's
right?
that's right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So in cases where you've seen brands do this poorly, I mean, Bud Light is the obvious example, but other brands, maybe you don't have to talk about which ones, but ones that you've worked with where they've executed it badly, is that mainly because of that? Is what you're saying? Is they've gone too far into what we believe versus what we are actually doing?
Yeah, so probably I think there are many reasons, like a stereotyping sometimes, like, okay, let's defend LGBTQ causes, like, but you don't have anyone in the team that is part of the LGBT um, plus community.
Mm.
I remember at the agency, and a couple of years ago, they were showing me a campaign for a client, and I was like, there was a woman in the team? And they were like, no. And I was like, go show that campaign to a woman in the agency and tell me what she says. And he was like, yes, they don't
Mm-hmm.
like it. Yeah, yeah, of course. So if you don't have diversity in the creation, you won't have a diverse message. So same thing. So many times, like clients, like we are going to do a campaign promoting this type of diversity, or we are going to do a campaign promoting this or that perspective. And okay, do you have, people with disabilities in the room? Do you have women in the room? Do you have people, black people in the no? So you can't
Yeah.
because you don't know about it. So you
Yeah.
obviously it's not gonna be obviously it's gonna be a stereotype. It's gonna be something that people will reject.
Yeah, definitely. And are they in the room and then how are you accommodating them as well, right? So I was telling a story recently where I was in a team bonding exercise at a prior company where there was somebody in a wheelchair in the room, and the exercise that they chose was everyone stands on a board, kind of like a twister type of board. So this one person couldn't stand and therefore couldn't be a part of the exercise, and it was just like a how did you not even consider their context, their situation, and how they might feel in that moment? So I think that's the other part that I think sometimes people miss is like you're ticking a box by having them there, but then also like even the example that you gave is like what is not just asking a woman what she thinks about it, but then taking her feedback and maybe adjusting the output.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What is the role, and yeah, and the empowerment that you give? It's actually You know, I was reading the other day the difference between equity and equality. And equity is,
Mm.
I mean, equality is giving the same to everyone, and equity is giving everyone what needs according to their needs and according to their situation to be able to compete and to be in a
Mm.
fair position, right?
Yeah, definitely. And so I think this is a topic that you're quite passionate about professionally and personally, right? And like a shout out to you won the DEI Person of the Year award from the New York Festival Advertising Awards. Like what does that mean and what does that mean to you?
Well, that was super. That was very very nice, and I was super happy because well, some years ago I started leading the Mexico office, the DDB Mexico office,
Mm.
and when I started, I discovered that one of the problems of that office that were like doing really poorly in terms of performance, in terms of creativity, in terms of all the metrics that are important for an advertising agency. I discovered that one of the factors it was because there was not a diversity culture. Actually, they said that for women it was like not um, uh, a good place to work or a place where they feel like comfortable. So I
Mm.
started working on that, trying to change that perspective, and I started like changing many things in the management team and trying to bring diversity and bring new ideas. And it was very interesting because we really quickly became a very creative shop in Mexico. Actually, in 2 years, we became the most creative agency in Mexico. Um, but also we became the top agency in DDB network in terms of employee engagement. So it was like all that happened really quickly. But for me, it was very satisfactory that what like the two uh, advertising campaigns that won most awards were about inclusion, diversity and inclusion. So so I was very happy because it was like, okay, we're living diversity and inclusion inside the agency, but our product, our creative product, is also reflecting that. And
Mm.
there were the people the members of the creative team that they were doing the submission of the advertising pieces for New York Festival, which is a very uh, important creative award. And they said, "Well, we discovered this. There's one of the criteria or categories that is like Person of the Year in diversity, and we want to nominate you because you've been working for diversity and inclusion." And I was like, "Oh, thank you. I feel super." I mean, it was like already. I feel super lucky already. As like I think the award is that you guys want to nominate me. So they did all the submission, and then we were informed that I was in the short list, and I was like, wow, I feel super, I feel like a winner already. And then I won it, and I was super happy. But it was, for me, the most important thing was the possibility of transforming an agency, proving that it is possible to grow in terms of business. It is possible to increase the level of creative reputation. It is possible to have higher employee engagement with diversity. If you
Mm-hmm.
make people feel welcome, if you make people feel um, they are appreciated, they are respected the way they are. It's like DDB has something that we call the four freedoms, and it's part of DDB culture. And one of the four freedoms is the freedom to be, and it's like you can be yourself inside the agency, and that's, for me, is super valuable. I'm gay myself, so I appreciate that. I know what it is like when in a workspace you can be yourself in front of a client. You can be yourself. So
Mm.
the only thing I did was like all that uh, I was feeling for ages that was important, trying to make it as a manager, trying to make it a reality for the agency, and it worked. So
Mm.
very long answer for a for a very specific question about New York Festival. But that was the
Yeah,
story
that's
behind
amazing.
that award.
That's amazing. Congratulations. I think that that's really, really meaningful. Particularly
Thank
because you were saying that it kind of was an enabler for how you can think about business growth in the context of DEI. And how potentially creating an accepting culture in the organization means that people feel more empowered, going back to that word that you used, to be able to come up and contribute and be a part of success stories that you're building for your clients and that you're building for your organization. So I love that tie-in as well. And I'm sure it was personally meaningful and rewarding for you as well, as you said. So the freedom to be me, that's really interesting. Just on that point quickly, do you find that there are places where you can't be yourself? Like, do you still encounter that? Just, I'm thinking particularly because you're like very successful and you're in parts of the world, like you live in like Dallas. I mean, I actually don't know. Maybe I shouldn't talk about this, but like Dallas doesn't feel like a place where you would get a huge amount of discrimination, or like Barcelona where you
you.
are now. It feels like they're quite freeing cultures, but I guess with certain clients or in certain parts of the world that you travel, do you still feel like you have to kind of censor yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's still a lot to do I think, I mean, I'm going to talk about the region that I know the most, which is Latin America.
Hmm.
I think there's been like huge advances in most of the countries, and people, I mean, to some extent, like people can, in our, at least in our, business context, can be themselves. But it's true that many times I like, like hear comments or like some ways of referring to someone, or that I was in the US, you couldn't say that, and I mean, you shouldn't,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not appropriate. But in other, in other markets, like in the US, that you learn to be very respectful, and you have to be very careful in many comments. Sometimes in Latin America, for me, it's quite shocking. Actually, in Spain, sometimes, like, it's a different culture. So that's the point where you have to understand that obviously cultures are different,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, for people, I'm pretty sure, but for some people, is offensive, is like, or at least is not comfortable. Let's
Yeah,
put
of
it that way.
course.
So yeah, it's
Right.
a lot to do. I think we're
Mm-hmm.
lucky, as you said, like, we're very lucky that we have the possibility to live in a country or in a business environment where diversity is appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, and my question feels really naive now that I'm thinking about it, like particularly because you do represent the Latin American countries that are more traditional, more conservative. Certain laws and policies are in place, so of course um, you have to be respectful of that when you're working with clients there, and when you're in those markets. Which leads me to a question that I had for you about working with the Latin American markets, and particularly with this is the first question that I sent you, is kind of this fine line that you probably have to balance on around, respecting the client needs and the commercial outcomes that your clients want and are paying for and deserve, and that kind of thing, but also the fact that you are in a role and in an agency where you're tasked with a level of conceptualization, exploration, ideation, and creativity that sometimes is a little bit at odds with the commercial aspect of designing an idea that sells. Like, how do you live with that kind of contrast from a day-to-day perspective?
No, that contrast is real. It happens obviously all the time. But I think what I said before, I think there's more consciousness now about the importance of emotion in the selling part. I really believe that emotional connection is sells more. Um, and obviously there are many research that proves this point. Um, I mean, Les Binet, Peter Field, and all this idea of the long and the short of it, and how like
Mm.
brand activation, like when you go completely commercial and going after performance, you get results in the short term. But when you build brand, you get results in the short term, but also in the long term. um I think it's I think the I mean, my answer would be like, it's all about like helping brands and clients to understand that. Sometimes it's hard in Latin America. There are a lot of like this perception, like when we need to sell, we have to go up front and try to be super commercial, and then so you have to do a lot of like teaching on like, let me show you a different perspective. Let me show you the power of emotion. Let me show you that when you connect, when you make people laugh, when you make people get a real emotion connected to the brand, that's going to help you sell more, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And that's something
Mm.
that is real. When an advertising message is able to create faith for the brand, um, you will sell more, and that's proven with many cases. So I think it's a is something that you have to um, help clients to understand that. But I think many clients, as I said before, are now very much conscious about the importance of emotion and the long term and the brand building. Like for me, I mean, Google. When I say Google, is all these digital um, advertising companies brought this idea of like attribution modeling, performance. You can track everything, and now many clients are discovering that they need to build brand. I mean, like, there's no attribution model. I mean, you can include in an attribution modeling an emotion that the brand created when you were a kid,
Mm,
and that's
mm,
real, when
mm,
you are buying a product. So I think is I think many brands are now aware of that.
mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And we have the evidence as well, which is really, really powerful around, through like neurological testing, where if you can engage a person's emotions when they're watching the ad or engaging with your brand, it actually like lights up their brain and creates that memory structure with recognizing what the brand is and creating, the connection with it, and therefore being more persuasive. So connecting with emotions
Absolutely.
works. There's proof in
Absolutely.
the pudding. Yeah. So,
Absolutely.
the point that you touched on there, though, is really interesting with the kind of the role of digital and social media and kind of performance metrics and everything, where it feels sometimes like the creative advertising communication space is, like even the point that you made about fame is how do I get a fame campaign? It's like, what is the formula? People are looking for the formula of success for campaigns. Do you feel like this desire to make something effective and efficient is creating kind of a creativity deficit in the industry, or do you feel like there is a kind of a creativity stagnation in advertising or in branding right now?
Ooh, that's a complex. I was going to say that the formula is being creative, and when I say the formula is being creative,
Mm.
it means that there's no formula. There's no formula, I think. Um, but I think there are. I mean, we see much more content created today, obviously, because we have, consumers creating content and people on all levels creating content. Like when you compare to some decades ago, it was like only brands and only, like um, certain parts of the society creating content. Now, like, many people can create content. In that sense, I think it's I think there's more creativity now, in the sense that actually brands can learn or can get inspired by people, what people, and we see it all the time in social media, like brands telling us, like, can we do a post based on this trendy topic or this trending, format that people are doing in social media. So it's brands getting inspired by people, which is super interesting. In that sense, I think there are more creativity now. Um,
Mm.
but I think the difference, I always, when that many times people say, like, well, but what's the difference between content and advertising? Is all advertising content, or? And I always say, well, for me, the difference between advertising and content is, like, content adds value to people. I mean, like, you
Mm.
can have the same TV ad, like 30-second ad in TV, like the traditional media, or you can have, a video in YouTube, or you can have a post in Instagram. If that post adds value to people, and it means, mm, gives you a good moment, or teaches you something that you want, you want to learn, or explains something to you that is interesting, or gives you, like, something valuable. For me, that's
Mm.
content. So for me, advertising is more about when you interrupt. You need both, and that would be a
Mm.
long discussion, if advertising should be replaced by content, and all that. I,
Mm.
I think there will be both will be needed. And it will be impossible to think. in a world that all brands only produce content. But the answer for me to your question is like make sure if in order to create fame for your brand, it's probably easier when you think with a content mentality instead of an advertising mentality.
Mm,
If you think you're creating content, you work to create content instead of creating advertising. Um, I think that's probably that's probably at least you are in the right attitude to get your brand famous or to make your brand and your advertising famous.
hmm. And is it important for the content to be consistent as well, for it to kind of ladder up to like the brand story or the persona of the brand that you're trying to continually amplify for that connection thread to exist? Or do you find that in the world of digital and social media, actually you can have quite disparate forms or types of content?
I think one of the things that social media has brought to the world of communication is that like the variety of tones. And so for me it's actually more difficult today to be able to be consistent,
Mm,
but it's true, and I truly believe that consumer is expecting brands to experiment more, to
mm,
prove different tones, to to go to in a different way, compared to some years ago that we were like super structured and the brand can only talk in this way, or the logo can only be displayed in this way. And now
mm,
you see the consumer playing around with brands, and it's part of the culture, like in the music. The brands are present in reggaeton. Brands are present in art, and in the things that people create in social media. Brands are present there. So it's more about that exploration. And I think the consumer is expecting brands to explore more and to, I wouldn't say take more risks. It's just like more to respond to the pop culture and the new trends and new, formats in the pop culture.
right. And probably what you're touching on there as well is to really engage them, like to create an experience that's a two-way conversation versus the traditional form of brand messaging, which is very one way, like here is what we're trying to push onto you, and forcing people to just watch passively versus content creation these days. I mean, like this podcast is an example of that, right? Where it's more engaging, you're building a community, you're engaging your fan base, and you want to hear from them, and you create content that really not only speaks to them in a more meaningful way, but also allows them to have a voice in that conversation.
Yeah, but that's one of the big challenges because it's like always the brands wants to like, oh, let's do something to get consumer generated content. It means like
Mm,
let's get consumers work for us. And that's not
mm,
that easy. And I think actually the wrong approach is trying to get consumers to produce content instead of, creating such an inspiring content, such an inspiring kind of, executions that the consumer actually feels interested in creating as well. So yeah, it's kind of that like that thing they said about happiness, that if you pursue it, you never get it, but if you like stand still. So it's more about like creating good content, creating understanding pop culture, bringing people, interesting people that are producing and innovating to work for the brand, to to open the doors of your brand and to let them drive, to let them be on the driver's seat, which is not easy. And many brands are get very stressed about that. But when you do that, you will get people create for the brand. And
mm.
obviously, you have to have a strong brand, a meaningful brand, because otherwise, people won't create just like for a brand that has no meaning or that has no like like interesting associations. So it's a long term,
Mm, mm.
task. It's not like, okay, let's launch a post saying like, we will publish the videos that people generate, and then you expect that people will create awesome videos about your brand. It's not that easy. It's more complex, but it's but when you get it, it's very rewarding. Absolutely.
Mm. And you have to have the commitment as well from the brand, like what you're saying, a commitment to also experiment and to approach communication and engagement with your customers in a different way than maybe traditionally what you have, or maybe what you were even taught in marketing school. Going back to that point that we started the conversation on, I'm sure there's a lot of things that you learned in school now that you're like, that doesn't apply anymore.
Yes, exactly, because actually the culture of marketing, the traditional culture of marketing is about getting everything right. So the logo is well applied, the colors are correct, the tone of voice of the brand is correct. You have a plan for next year, like everything that you're gonna execute next year. And what about when you find that there's a new trending, like people are doing something funny in social media that's not in your marketing plan, but you have to do it. So yeah, a lot of the tradition, I think we come from a marketing culture of control and planning. And I think that the secret now is building brands with a more spontaneous approach. Obviously, a strategic approach. You have to know where you want to take the brand to, but with a more spontaneous and more open-minded mindset.
I love that so much. Yeah. It's a really beautiful point to end on as well, with reiterating what you said, the quote, which I'm going to be using all the time. The formula for creativity is that there is no formula, so you have to break rules and be spontaneous. I love that. So that leads us beautifully into the last question that I have for you. And one way that you can um, be spontaneous and think about how you can do things differently is to read Juan's trend report, which I'm going to link into the show notes. It's an amazing report, very, very insightful, one of my favorites from this year. So thank you for publishing that for everybody to benefit from. Which leads me to the last question, which is what your go-to is when you're trying to get spontaneous ideas, or to look outside of the kind of the bubble that you're normally in, and to look outside.
Well, first, it's an honor for me that you say that it's one of the favorite reports that you read. I mean, you made my day, my week, my year. So thank you very much for that. Well, it's. I mean, for me, the trend report is it started as a personal exercise. I started like every year at the beginning. I was like, okay, let's see what's happening in the world, what topics are interesting, and I started doing for myself. Then I shared at some point with my team in planning, and someone told me like, why don't you publish this and put it out there? And now it's like people from October telling me when is the trend report out, and
Me,
I
me
use that
included.
week. Thanks. And I use that last week of the year that is like usually like more on holidays and all to to create the report. But the motivation is the same as the one I started, which is like, what are the topics? Like, there are many things happening in the world, but where are those 8 things that I would say I think are relevant for brands? Always with
Mm,
that perspective of I want to discover what are the key topics for brands. So is that is simple. Is an exercise born out of curiosity, and I think
mm.
I wanted to keep being that way because is what makes me like that gives me the motivation to do it every year.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. And so the trend report probably does a lot of this for you, is kind of helps you to look outside. But do you have another go-to that you
Oh,
use
okay.
to help,
Sorry.
stretch your
Now I
thinking?
have to. Now it's time to answer the question. Mire, look, everything. I like to. I mean, it can. I mean, many trends can come out of walking the street, watching a movie, having a good conversation with interesting people, reading a lot of. I Something that inspires me a lot is like
Mm,
papers from philosophers, sociologists, people that are like reading the society on a macro level.
mm,
That's something that inspired me a lot. But honestly, it comes from everywhere. What I do, I mean, from methodological perspective, is I do a mind map. So around September, October, I start collecting everything that I see that is relevant. But I have a lot of things in my mind already happening. So I start putting everything and connecting the dots. And what I
Mm.
do at the end for the report is that, but it's from inspiration can come from really from any place, and any conversation, piece of information, movies. I'm reading from everywhere all the time. So I think that's where the information and the inspiration comes from.
I love that. That's awesome. And yeah, if you have any favorite philosophers or sociologists whose papers you read, please send them through. I'm sure that the audience would love to take a look at those as well. But speaking of good conversations with interesting people, Juan, this was super, super interesting. Sparked so many thoughts for me. So thank you so, so much for your time and for coming on the show.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, this conversation. Very, very good questions, and awesome conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan.